Good. So the next speaker is Ernst Zurcher, and Ernst is a professor in wood science, and he's a researcher at the Bern University of Applied Science in Switzerland. His research is focused on wood, tree vitality, spiral structures, and sustainable development. How about that, Ernst? And chronobiology. And this is what he will talk about today, about lunar cycles and influences on plants.
Thank you for this opportunity to speak in this fantastic water conference. I would invite you to shift from very precise and microscopic dimensions to macroscopic dimensions up to cosmic dimensions, making first a small excursion into a history of science where an interesting path had been entered but wasn't followed further. And then I will invite you to come into the world of the trees, of the tree material, the wood as a material, with two questions or two aspects. When does material shape water, and when does water shape materials? These two polar questions will be suggested here. Lunar rhythmicities and properties of water interacting with plants. That's my proposition of a title. Here with anatomic structures of a spruce tree in a transverse section where we see the cells, the tracheids, which are the water conducting cells cut in transverse direction. You must imagine that as long tubes closed but in connection with neighbor tubes, and the water goes actually into the crown of the tree. That's resin duct, another component of the system. When we speak of moon, we have different aspects to treat. For example, the synodic moon rhythm, it's the change between new moon and full moon, and with the first quarter, the last quarter. And in fact, we must have more elements or more detailed sequences in this cycle to come into understanding the biology of plants, for example. We have different moon rhythms. The synodic period, the one I mentioned just before, with 29.5 days, and linked with that, the Earth turning on itself. You have the tidal rhythm. It's just the component moon added to the sun, which modulates the gravitation on the Earth's surface. The Earth is represented here, the moon turning around the Earth, and both are making their way. And the synodic rhythm is when the Earth is again in the same position, alignment to the sun, between the Earth and the sun. And the other rhythm is the sidereal period, when the moon seen from the Earth is again in front of the same point of the background, of the star background. That's the sidereal rhythm, for example, in front of the zodiacal constellations. That are the two rhythms. So you see the moon independently of the phase traveling through the ecliptic, and traveling in front of fixed stars belonging to the zodiacal band. And in addition to that, you have visitors, planets, which are also traveling in this plane, and the moon is also sometimes in connection or in opposition with planets, as it is sometimes with the sun, seen from the Earth. That are the aspects that we are going to see today concerning trees. Now, history of science. In the late 20s, Georg Wilhelm Mag has published a book called Planeteneinflüsse, Influences of Planets. And in a general comprehension of the word planets, it includes also moon and other astronomical events. And interesting, it was in edition, West-East edition, and I find that interesting. He made very precise research based on glass capillaries, which are revealing the sensitivity of water for astronomical events. And this was based on a suggestion of Rudolf Steiner, 1861 to 1925, who recommended to make scientific trials using dilutions of metallic salts in water, but dropping from fine capillaries in order to observe planetary occurrences or planetary events. That's at the moment when it was expressed looked very strange as a suggestion. Water in capillaries should have to do with what happens in the astronomical system. So Mag has built, first he had to create or to find people able to make capillaries in this sense. Glass makers are able to make very thin, and the length is also very important. If they are too short, then when you fill or when the filling, the next filling is needed, then you see an influence on the droplets formation. But when they are very long, then it doesn't make any difference if the capillary is full or not. In very long capillaries, you can obtain these devices in such a fine form that the drops, in the first experiments, it was a drop every a few minutes, then every 15 minutes. And the last capillaries used in this device produced drops every 1.5 and 2 hours, but in a regular form. That was at that level capillary production. So they had several parallel capillaries, and they observed on paper when the drops fall on the paper, and they observed, they measured, of course, temperature and pressure and all the elements of the laboratory. And the events were parallel, in separate parallel capillaries. The time from one drop to the next one was synchronous compared between the capillaries. The temperature here represented in inverse form has an influence, but a very, not a complete influence on what's happening. When the temperature is higher, then the time, that means lower when it's like that, because the scale is in this sense, then the outflow is a little more rapid, or when it's colder, then the outflow is reduced. So the time used from one drop to the other in comparison with the mean time will be different. So that are two different capillaries, and on this representation we see how similar the movements are between the drop production of these two capillaries. At the same moment you have peaks, and this peak has been attributed to a conjunction of Mercury with Sun. One event is no event, but then this type of astronomical event repeatedly was observed in capillary drops. The next device was then with a mechanical system with a paper band which was rolled, and every time the drops fold on in a certain line on this paper, and they then just had to measure from one drop to the other, knowing the speed of the cylinder producing the paper. And these drops were falling every 1.5 or 2 hours. And then in this very low speed of drop production, they discovered incredible things in connection with cosmic events. That's a representation. You have here several days with the moon phases. Here is the pressure, the air pressure, which has also a single slow relation to the moon phases, to the gravimetric tides. The temperature, and here temperature is a very low effect. Air pressure, almost nothing. And here you see the variations of the drop production by these capillaries. They recognize here the last quarter, the first quarter, and here again conjunction with Mercury and Sun, as we have seen before. Before it was just the detail of this, but here we see repeated connections with Moon. Once again, another representation. Here is over several days the moon cycles, and these small curves represent when the moon is under the horizon or above the horizon. And here we see exactly every day. It's in fact lunar days. We have peaks around the third quarter, and the peaks around the first quarter, another movement around the new full moon, and every day or every lunar day we have then a minimum linked to the moon in comparison with the Earth horizon. Here again a cosmic event that is Mercury and Moon conjunction. Well, that's a big world which is opened with these researches, and they didn't find a continuation, but these books exist and in very few exemplaries, and I'm lucky to have found it. Now the question is, if already glass capillaries are so sensitive, what happens with plant capillaries, with organic capillaries? In fact, all the cells which have the function of bringing the water into the crown have a capillary aspect. They are very thin. They are built in with certain substances which are hydrophilic, and depending on the species, they are very long or a little shorter, but always with this capillary effect. There are two capillary effects, one in the lumen of the cell, where the water flows freely, but also in the cell wall, which is porous. We have a double capillary effect. So here is the representation of cells as individuals, and when they are in tissues, that's a model of wood, and microscopical transverse section, all these cells are water conducting cells with capillary properties. And what is the effect, or what does this bring to the plant? This appeared in our research on chronobiology of trees, the biology of rhythms, and here we could find again, like Mark with glass capillaries, effects on plants of astronomic events. Once again, one single cell with surrounding cells, and the cell wall is composed of lignin, of hemicelluloses, and of cellulose. And in the inner part of the cell, we have a big amount of cellulose compared to the other components. That means that the inner part of the cell, where the water is flowing, is very much hydrophilic. Again, a suggestion here, something important happens in terms of easy water. And it is pulled up into the crown. It's not a positive pressure, it's a negative pressure. It's through hydrophilic conducts and under tension. And this is a double effect probably on water properties. One recognized property of such capillaries in tree anatomy, in conifer anatomy, for example, where these tracheids are very thin, is that they reduce the point where water is freezing. They make the trees frost resistant. The water, the temperature can go down to 15 degrees, and the water is still liquid, viscous but liquid. There is no formation of crystals down to minus 20 degrees or temperatures like that. That is a recognized effect of these capillaries. And now research has been done in plant water interaction. For example, seeds. You put dry seeds into water, and you can make that with your bean seeds in your kitchen. You look at your calendar. When is it before full moon, at full moon, after full moon? You take always the same number of bean seeds, you take their weight, and you look how much water will be absorbed. And that makes very interesting changes. Here it was under controlled laboratory conditions with repeated tests. And you have the water absorption of dry seeds put into water, which is always changing in very short times. That's the synodic moon sequence, full moon, new moon, and in 2 or 3 days you go from 50 to 60% water uptake. That means in a short time of 3 days you have a change of 20% less or more water uptake. 20% less or more, that with dry seeds, which are inert, which are in resting position, that means that things must also happen on the water side to make such differences. Then germination tests with the same phenomenon, such differences for tomatoes sowing just before full moon or just before new moon, maize coleoptiles. Again, these sequences in 4 lunar weeks, very clear lunar shaped. That means synchron with the lunar cycles. It's difficult to speak of lunar influence. It's not the moon, maybe, which has this type of influence. I'm still open for the explanation that it is the moon which travels in front of the sun, but also in front of other constellations. We could show that this makes also a difference for wood properties as a material. Good results have been obtained by reanalyzing an old research which pretended to show there is no moon effect, and a new analysis showed that they were significant. The research on tree physiology, the plant, the tree stem are always swelling and shrinking, also under controlled laboratory or greenhouse conditions, under darkness, and the Italian researchers discovered a periodicity of, instead of 24, 25 hours. And in connection with them, we could make a new analysis and show that the gravimetric tides, the change, very tiny change of gravimetric force on the Earth due to lunar cycles, can explain these changes. It's not a direct gravimetric influence on the plant because these gravimetric forces are too weak, but it's a synchronicity. This was then confirmed by research by Barlow, Mikulek and Srestik in the year 12 years later. And an interesting field is also the plant movements. The bean leaves are always changing between day and night, but you can have constant laboratory conditions and look how are they going to make their leaf movements. And this led to the book of Günter Klein, Farewell to the Internal Clock. He could show that these movements are not an internal clock in the genetic or cell structure, difficult to find out. There you have mechanisms, but not the origin of the time. The Zeitgeber, the timekeeper, is not in the cell itself. It is outside of the cell, and it was clear. That was the data from measurement of these movements, and later with this new hypothesis that could be gravimetric synchronicities, then it could be shown that you have something like turning points in the plant behavior, which is initiated by what is happening in the tide movements or variations. That are typical gravimetric turning points, and even it's interesting, it's a time shift which is even before, but it's synchronous. So here you cannot say it's a causal phenomenon, it's a synchronicity. It happens together, but it is not the turning point of gravimetry which produced the change, because the change is already happening before, and here also, but it is synchronous. Beautiful questions for science. You put electrodes on trees in the summer and in the winter, and you get bioelectric potential differences up to 30 millivolts on a spruce tree, and they are also in certain periods in phase with the gravimetric curves. The maxima are always at the same place, and even the air pressure at quiet weather, when there is no change of weather, also make these tides. You have tides of air pressure, and the plants electrically are doing the same. So you have really a coherent system in the atmosphere with the biosphere. And when we put electrodes on the trees, we have such fine potential variations which can be shown also in addition. Before it was shown that it is gravimetric tides, that is 1 through 4 days, very detailed, and here at the level of 2 months we have changes between full moon and new moon, but there are always some biological interferences, but in general the maximum is just after full moon and the minimum is around new moon, like here. And that's a very interesting observation, because the wood material, the tree material wood, is also behaving in such rhythms. In addition, we had also, there was research on potential of poplar tree and other tree species, which is changing like that. And here we recognize not only the maxima and the minima of the tidal rhythms, but when the tides are at minimum, at the first and at the last quarter, you have also the electric activity, which is less than around full moon and around new moon. in our sleeping physiology, we have also the most activity around full moon. Melatonin level is then very low. Another analysis on Quercus ceres, turkey oak. Here it's not only the electrical potential, but also the water flow through the plant. The sap flow is here analyzed and has the same rhythmicities. So electrically and hydrologically, the plants are connected to the lunar cycles in forms of tides. Now we shift from wood as living material, trees living organisms, and look what happens with wood produced by the trees, but in the inner part of the tree, it is considered that wood is dead. There is no living cell anymore. They are just kept living in the periphery, but in the main corpus of the tree, you don't have living cells. But is this organic material, wood, still absolutely inert, or does it keep something like a memory and information? We made a big research with 600 trees, more than 600 trees in whole Switzerland, felled the trees. And the moment of felling the tree, that is old knowledge, like the Egyptians, we don't know how did they know that. In our forestry tradition, it is known that when you fell the tree, you shape the properties of wood. Once you will have good firewood, and once you will have good construction wood. Once it will be very easy to burn, and once it will be very difficult to provoke the decay. They are resistant to fungi. And that's important to know that exactly, to have good construction wood, and sometimes you need good firewood, and you will cut the tree at different moments in observation of the lunar rhythms. We made this research without taking moon into account. It was just sequenced every Monday and every Thursday. And so we had material which was not with a lunar bias, and we could analyze it with statistics and put the question according to the position of the moon at that or this period with these wood samples, which look like that, tests just according to the norms. And we could show that there are very clear lunar effects on the water loss during the drying process. That's for spruce, or the final density. When the water is lost very easily, the density will be low. And when the water loss is not so strong, when the water is kept in the cells, but kept in the cells, that means that at 103 degrees, it doesn't leave the wood material, it's trapped water, then the density will be high. And so we had significant lunar effects in spruce and in chestnut, but not in the same way exactly. So there is a specific difference also. And here we can observe the difference of samples which has been obtained in the 3.7 days before full moon compared to the samples, for example, of the 3.7 days just after full moon, taking the full moon with the precision of a minute for these trials. Why 3.7? It's a half lunar week, which is 7.4 days. And so you can see the days before full moon are in yellow, and the days just after full moon are in green, and that's for water loss. So just before full moon, the water is very easily lost, and just after full moon, it's more difficult to lose water in these 3 or 4 months in winter. And then the resulting relative density, easy water loss brings low density, and difficult water loss brings a higher density. Again, good water loss here, low density, and less water loss, higher density. Then these samples have been dried to absolute state, And after drying the wood, we would assume that then there is no water history anymore. The wood has been dried and he forgets what water is. And with this question, we immersed these dried wood from these trees, but it were new samples from the same trees. And we looked what is the water absorption by capillarity, just putting the long samples just in the lower part into water, or by immersion, absorption by all the faces. And here we observed that it is exactly the same sense. For absorption, it is again much better when the water was easy to lose and much less than when the water was difficult to lose. But in a much wider range. Here the difference is from 125 to 75. The memory is much stronger than the event which shapes the cells. And that's why these lunar effects are long-lasting after using the wood as construction material. It's not just at the moment of felling the trees, but it is also when you have your wood on your building, on the facade, for example. Now we have elements for new technologies. We know how to make registration of electrical potential on standing trees. And at that moment, we have received the best wood for construction, the very dense wood, which didn't lose much water, but this water is completely blocked. And then we observed that the strength and the resistance to fungi is better. And the best firewood is then here around New Moon. So I could imagine that in the future we will have monitored trees to shape the wood properties. That's future music. Another aspect, taking into account lunar cycles in germination, when we think about our common challenges and opportunities at the global scale we will have in climate change to make big reforestation. The Bonn Challenge in the 2010s has brought together 47 governments who identified 350 million hectares which can be reforested in the next years in order to compensate our too much CO2 production into the atmosphere. These reforestation are, for example, the Great Green Wall in southern Sahel in Africa, but in other countries also. And then we will need very big tree nurseries with millions and billions of trees, and then it will be important to shape these trees in order to be resistant to difficult conditions. And here again, the cosmos will be helping us together with the trees. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ernst. We have time for a couple of questions. Yes, Jerry.
Well, your excuse me, beautiful data and so intriguing, but you didn't really discuss mechanism for all of this. And I'm just thinking, just wondering, since if easy water is somehow involved next to cellulose, which makes sense to me, and we know that easy water buildup is dependent on light, is it possible that the different phases of the moon are associated with, for example, different wavelengths of light that reach the Earth, and that could conceivably be the cause of many of these different effects? Is that possible, or do you have a different idea?
Yes, this is a possibility. It is known that lunar light is polarized. It's not the same quality of light. It is polarized, and research has been done on effect of polarized light on leaf physiology, for example, when how is charge changed into sugars and things like that, using polarized light. And there is an exciting effect. But when you make germinations, you can make it in the soil without light effect. Concerning the explanation of all these facts, phenomena, there is an interesting new model of gravitation defined or developed by Gerhard Dorda from the University of Munich, or from the German Army University of Munich. He was in the Nobel Prize work of von Klitzing, the quantum Hall effect, a very high level of physics. And Dorda developed a new model of gravimetry, not the Newtonian one. In addition to the Newtonian one, he postulates a quantization of time in addition to that. And for him, the gravitation has also to do with the movements of the planets. It's not only the masses, but the movement of the sun and of the moon and of the Earth are taken into account by his new model. And in this model, he was able, and we get connected because we have seen the curve of nature, these three diameter fluctuations. And without knowing each other, he used this curve of the Nature publication. This curve here, that's the gravimetric curve, and this curve of the tree was for him a kind of validation of his new model, because in this model he is able to, one important fact is he postulates that with this model he can explain that the coherence level of water molecules, for example, is changing in a ratio from 1 to 2,000. And then it goes back in lunar and in this type of rhythms. Gerhard Dorda. And that would be, for me, an explanation. That is, the coherence means clusters or clouds flowing in these physiological movement activities. And in this form, we could imagine a kind of explanation. Gravimetry is not anymore as it was imagined. According to Dorda, we must rethink gravimetry in a dynamic form. He has been translated in English. He published that. It is possible to find him.
My question is, my friend from Russia, Professor Dubrov, Alexander Dubrov, had fundamental research human biorhythmic moon. He informed me that for him had been so difficult doctoral dissertation of this topic, and the book is also with different diseases in English. Do you have more information about the influence of the moon on human health? And second question is, I look at in scientific papers in the time of your lecture, there are not so much proof or directly influence on the water spectrum. Do you want to make additional research with water spectrum directly influenced from the moon?
This would be very interesting, but it should be made in parallel. I'm not specialist in water research, but I immediately understood when you are making wood research, you are at the same time making water research, and when you make tree research, you are at the same time making water research. So we could reanalyze things we have made or make in parallel new research. Dubrov is very interesting. I read his books with very much interest. And geomagnetics is also very important for him. It's also one component. It's a multi-factor component, but it's also working at this level. In human physiology, the nicest research paper has been published in 2013 by the University of Basel. It is sleep physiologists, a sleep laboratory. And it was a joke at the beginning, at the bar. If we did analyze once our data according to the moon phases, they had tons of data, conventionally analyzed, and then they had the funny idea to look, did the moon have any effect on our data? They retook their data, and they could show that there are very clear effects. And in the sleeping speed, the time you need to sleep in, it's changing according to the moon phases. For example, rapid eye movement is changing according to the moon phases. New moon is much more quiet than full moon period, 3-4 days around full moon, and again new moon. The first and the third quarter are also different. And the most impressive is the level of melatonin. The sleep hormone is very much lower, something like 2/3, 60% around full moon compared to around new moon. At full moon time, don't try to sleep. It's without chance. You make something else. But that is interesting from recent research. And now with that, we can imagine that there are books on medicine, surgeons, for example, who observe that the reaction of the organism after interventions is different according to the moon periods. But still things to do. You have also many papers which show that there is no effect in birth statistics, for example. But these cycles are anyway lunar cycles. If you take the menstrual cycle, it's just shifted, it's individualized, but there is the famous experience of young girls being together in a school, and then they are completely in phase, and exactly in phase with the moon.
Okay, thank you, Ernst. Thank you for a very interesting presentation.